Somewhere in a Norwegian genetics lab, a sample of modern blood is quietly telling a story nobody prepared for. It is not a story about heroes. It is not a story about longships or gold. It is a story about a chemical trigger, a battlefield trance, and a bloodline that refused to disappear. For over 1,000 years, historians dismissed the berserkers as myth, exaggeration, saga poetry designed to terrify enemies who were already terrified. But new genetic mapping of Scandinavia is forcing a very different question onto the table. What if the rage was real? What if the drug was real? And what if the genes behind both of them never actually left? For centuries, one word alone was enough to empty a battlefield before a single blow was struck, and that word was berserker. Norse chroniclers described men who fought without armor, who felt no pain, who bit down on their own shields, who walked toward fire as if it were water. They were said to be immune to iron. They were said to kill with a single strike and keep moving without slowing down, without blinking, without any recognition of friend or foe. According to informed historical sources, the Old Norse texts describe these men as being mad as dogs and as strong as a bear or bull, which is not the language medieval scribes used lightly. Think about what that means. These were not poetic exaggerations invented for entertainment. These were battlefield reports, written by people who had watched something happen that they could not otherwise explain. But here's where it gets worse. Nobody, not even the Norse themselves, could fully explain what triggered this state. The word berserker gang describes the trance itself, a total psychological transformation that arrived suddenly and vanished just as fast, leaving the warrior exhausted, disoriented, and sometimes physically wrecked for days afterward. And that detail is the one modern researchers cannot let go of, because rage does not normally cause blurred vision. Rage does not normally cause days of lingering headaches. Something else was happening inside these men, something chemical, something that left a signature the sagas recorded without understanding it. For a long time, the leading theory pointed toward a small blood-red mushroom that grows across the pine forests of northern Europe, the fly Agaric Amanita muscaria. It looks almost cartoonish, a bright crimson cap dotted with white flecks, the exact image most people picture when they think of a fairy tale toadstool. And for decades, this was the accepted explanation in documentaries, in books, and casual conversation. Warriors ate the mushroom, entered a hallucinogenic haze, and turned into unstoppable killing machines. It was a clean story. It was a satisfying story. The real story is far messier and far more unsettling, because when modern researchers actually tested this theory against the clinical evidence, it began to fall apart almost immediately. According to the Viking Museum in Stockholm, fly agaric would have made warriors particularly worthless warriors, since the side effects include drowsiness, vomiting, muscle spasms, and numbness in arms and legs. Read that again. Drowsiness, vomiting, numbness. Those are not the symptoms of an unstoppable killing machine. Those are the symptoms of a man who cannot stand up straight, let alone charge through a shield wall. And this is where everything changes, because if the mushroom theory was wrong, that means one of the most repeated facts in Viking history, a fact printed in textbooks and documentaries for generations, was built on nothing more than folklore dressed up as science. So if it wasn't the mushroom, what was it? This is where a very different name enters the story, a name most people outside academic circles have never heard. Karsten Vater, an ethnobotanist working out of the University of Ljubljana, spent years studying a completely different plant family, one connected to witchcraft trials, medieval medicine, and outright poisonings across pre-modern Europe. His research, published in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology, pointed toward a plant called black henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. And what most people are not seeing is just how disturbing this plant's documented effects actually are. Henbane is not a hallucinogen in the gentle, dreamy sense people associate with psychedelics. It belongs to the nightshade family, the same botanical group that includes deadly nightshade and mandrake, plants long associated with poison, sorcery, and death across European folklore. Its active compounds are anticholinergic, meaning they interfere directly with the nervous system's ability to regulate itself. And the symptoms it produces read like a checklist pulled straight from the sagas: increased physical strength, flushed, reddened skin, delirium, dilated pupils, violent, uncontrolled twitching, and critically, the one symptom fly agaric never reliably produced: unprovoked explosive aggression. Think about what that means for a moment. This is not chaos. This is strategy. If Vatur's theory is correct, the berserkers were not simply eating a wild mushroom they stumbled across in the forest. They may have been deliberately, ritually consuming a plant known throughout medieval Europe for inducing psychosis, violence, and a complete detachment from physical pain. According to Vater's own research, the anesthetic properties of henbane may explain why these warriors appeared to shrug off wounds that would have dropped an ordinary soldier instantly, creating the terrifying illusion that they simply could not be hurt at all. And here is the detail that should genuinely unsettle you. This plant was not some obscure secret lost to history. Henbane was so deeply embedded in early Scandinavian and medieval culture that it was even added to medieval beers, so much so that authorities banned that practice in 1507. Read that again. Governments had to pass laws banning people from brewing this plant into their alcohol, centuries after the Viking Age had already ended, because the practice was still widespread enough to be a public danger. That is not a fringe theory about an obscure warrior cult. That is evidence of a substance so culturally normalized that it had to be legislated out of existence. But according to informed sources within the ethnobotanical research community, the picture is more complicated than a simple swap from mushroom to plant. Some researchers argue that the physiological match between henbane and berserker symptoms is compelling specifically because both intoxication and rage share overlapping anticholinergic signatures. The same kind of poisoning doctors still see today in emergency rooms when people accidentally ingest nightshade plants. Patients showing up disoriented, aggressive, and agitated after contact with these compounds is not folklore. It is documented modern clinical reality, which means the sagas may have been describing actual poisoning symptoms centuries before anyone understood the pharmacology behind them. And this is where the story stops being about a plant and starts being about something far bigger, something that reaches all the way into the present day. Because a warrior's rage does not survive 1,000 years. A ritual does not survive 1,000 years, not intact, not unchanged, but DNA does. And that is exactly where modern science decided to go looking. In 2020, an international team led by geneticist S.K. Willerslev completed what remains the largest DNA sequencing project ever conducted on Viking-era remains, extracting and analyzing genetic material from 442 skeletons scattered across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Ukraine, Poland, Greenland, and beyond. This was not a small sample size pulled from one burial mound. This was, according to informed sources at the University of Cambridge, a project that would rewrite the history books. And the first thing it rewrote was the very definition of what a Viking actually was. What most people are not seeing is that being a Viking was never a matter of bloodline in the way popular culture imagines it. The study revealed something extraordinary, that several individuals in Norway were buried as Vikings, but their genes identified them as Sami, an indigenous population genetically distinct from Scandinavian ancestry entirely. Let that sink in. Men buried with Viking weapons, Viking rituals, Viking honors, were not genetically Scandinavian at all. A Viking, it turns out, was closer to a job description, a cultural identity, a way of life anyone could step into regardless of where their ancestors came from. But here's where it gets worse, or depending on how you look at it, far more interesting. Even as the study proved that Viking identity was fluid and culturally porous, it also proved something else entirely, something that pulls the story directly toward Norway specifically. The genetic data showed that certain regions of Scandinavia, and mid-Norway in particular, displayed relatively homogeneous genetic information, especially when compared to trading hub islands like Gotland and Öland, which showed extremely high genetic diversity due to constant contact with foreign travelers, merchants, and settlers. Read that again. While the great Viking trade ports were absorbing genetic material from across the known world, pockets of Norway were staying comparatively isolated, comparatively unchanged, comparatively continuous. And this is exactly where the DNA trail starts pointing somewhere unexpected. Because if certain Norwegian populations experience less genetic dilution over the centuries than other Viking-descended regions, that means the biological thread connecting Viking-age Norwegians to present-day Norwegians is measurably stronger there than almost anywhere else touched by the Norse expansion. This is not folklore. This is not nationalist mythology dressed up as science. This is population genetics, cold and measurable, showing that some Norwegian communities carry a more direct, less interrupted genetic line back to the Viking Age than the history books ever gave them credit for. Now widen the lens even further because the story does not stop with one single study. In January of a follow-up landmark analysis published in the journal Cell, researchers expanded the picture dramatically, combining data from over 200 ancient genomes with genetic material pulled from more than 16,500 modern Scandinavians. According to that research, one of the most lasting genetic influences on the region came not from raiding, but from something far more uncomfortable: waves of forced migration. The study noted that gene flow from the British-Irish Isles during this period seems to have had a lasting impact on the gene pool in most parts of Scandinavia, a legacy tied directly to the Norse practice of bringing captured people back from raids across the British Isles. Think about what that means. The genetic fingerprint carried by many modern Scandinavians today is not purely a story of conquerors and their descendants. It is also, quietly, a story of the enslaved and the displaced, woven permanently into the same bloodlines as the warriors who took them. The Vikings did not just leave genes in Scotland, England, and Ireland during their raids. They brought genes back with them, and those genes never left. This is where the narrative most YouTube documentaries skip entirely, because it complicates the myth. It is far easier to sell audiences on invincible blonde warriors than on a genetically tangled, morally uncomfortable truth. But the real story is always the one nobody wants to simplify. And here's the part of this that moves beyond academic curiosity and into something with real present-day weight. According to researchers writing for The Conversation, the popularization of Viking DNA testing has created a strange psychological phenomenon among people who take these commercial ancestry tests today. Interviewees have openly used their so-called Viking genes as explanation for personal traits, with one man from the United States stating that learning of his Viking descent made it clearer to him why there might be a genetic preponderance of violence and explosive anger in my family. Read that again, slowly. A modern human being, sitting in his own home, attributing his personal anger, possibly his own family's dysfunction, to a genetic inheritance from Viking age warriors he has never met, based on a mail-order saliva test. This is where everything changes, because it reveals something far more dangerous than a single mislabeled mushroom theory ever could. The idea of the berserker gene, whether or not it is scientifically precise, has escaped the laboratory entirely and taken root in the popular imagination as a kind of biological destiny. What most people are not seeing is that this is not new. The same imagery, the pure-blooded, unstoppable Norse warrior, was a fiction that arose in the simmering nationalist movements of late 19th century Europe, and according to informed sources, it remains celebrated today among certain extremist groups who use the supposed superiority of the Vikings to justify hatred. A scientific finding about genetic continuity in mid-Norway, something that should belong purely to population genetics and archaeology, carries real risk of being twisted into something far uglier the moment it leaves the hands of careful researchers. So where does that leave the actual science? Stripped of nationalism, stripped of myth, stripped of clickbait? It leaves us with a picture that is genuinely more compelling than the simplified version, precisely because it refuses to resolve neatly. The berserkers likely were not summoning demonic strength through pure willpower or divine possession, as the sagas poetically claimed. According to the informed scientific consensus building around fighters' research, they were far more likely under the influence of a genuinely dangerous anticholinergic plant compound, one capable of masking pain, triggering violent aggression, and leaving physiological wreckage in its wake for days afterward. This was not shamanic transcendence. This was closer to something modern emergency room physicians would recognize instantly as toxic plant poisoning. And the genetic thread connecting those men to the people walking around Norway today is real, but it is nowhere near as clean or as dramatic as viral headlines like to suggest. It is not a single berserker gene lying dormant in modern Norwegian DNA, waiting to be switched on. It is something far subtler and, honestly, far more scientifically interesting. A documented pattern of relative genetic continuity in specific regions, layered underneath centuries of migration, mixing, forced displacement, and cultural reinvention. The real story is never the simple one. It is the tangled one, the one that resists a tidy ending. But here's where the uncertainty begins, and where even the experts start to diverge. Because genetics can tell us who someone's ancestors were. It cannot tell us what those ancestors felt, believed, or ritually consumed before walking into battle. The plant-based theory of berserker rage remains, by Fader's own admission, speculative, built on symptom matching and historical plausibility, rather than a smoking gun of physical evidence found directly on a berserker's remains. No archaeologist has yet pulled a Viking skeleton from Scandinavian soil with traces of henbane still present in preserved stomach contents, offering the kind of undeniable proof this story ultimately still lacks. Which means the door remains open, uncomfortably open, for future discovery. Advances in ancient biomolecule analysis, the same technology capable of pulling residual traces of ancient diets and substances out of preserved dental plaque and gut remains, are improving every single year. What was scientifically impossible a decade ago is becoming routine today. Somewhere out there, in a burial site not yet excavated, in a skeleton not yet tested, the physical proof connecting the berserker myth to a specific consumed substance may already be sitting in the ground, waiting. And that leaves the modern population of Norway occupying a strange, unresolved position in this entire narrative. They are the genetic inheritors of a people whose most famous warriors may have fought under the influence of a plant capable of inducing psychosis. They carry, in some regions more directly than others, a bloodline that stretches back through raiders, traders, enslaved captives, and the isolated farming communities who never left the fjords at all. What most people are not seeing is that this inheritance is not a story about superiority or destiny. It is a story about how thoroughly human history refuses to stay buried, resurfacing generation after generation in fragments of bone, strands of ancient DNA, and the strange, persistent modern desire to explain ourselves through the violence of people who lived 1,000 years before we were born. So the question the researchers are now quietly sitting with is not whether the berserkers existed. That much the sagas, the linguistics, and the symptom matching make difficult to seriously dispute. The real question is stranger and far less comfortable. If a plant compound could chemically manufacture something as extreme as the berserker state in ordinary men 1,000 years ago, what does that say about the line separating deliberate ritual from accidental mass poisoning across an entire warrior culture? And if segments of the modern Norwegian population really do carry a more direct, less diluted genetic thread back to that era than almost anywhere else the Vikings ever touched, the final unanswered question is the one no lab result can settle on its own. Not whether the blood remembers, but whether given the right circumstances it could ever be provoked to answer back.